But the folks, I want to make sure that they introduce themselves, speak a little bit about the organization that they work for, the work that they're doing, and then we're going to get right down to it and talk about both briefly about the history of how these came to be, but more importantly, where we are right now and what we have to do to move forward. She was introduced by Keith, but you should not know her as just the lady who stalks him apparently over in Harlem. Delcenia Glover is the campaign manager for Tenants and Neighbors, one of the premier organizing groups. They have been not only allies to me, but they have educated me very much in the last 4 or 5 years as I've been the senator on issues of tenants and on rent stabilization. So please welcome Ms. Delcenia Glover.
Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
How's everybody doing?
All right.
How many rent-regulated tenants do we have in the room? Okay. And the other people, the people who didn't raise their hands, you are market tenants?
Not here.
Market? Oh, I feel sorry for
Probably a couple.
So, first of all, I want to give a shout out to Jimmy McMillan, who coined the phrase, "the rent is too damn high." I hear this phrase everywhere I go, on television. I've heard Governor Cuomo, everybody saying the rent's. Mr. McMillan could have been rich. He should have copyrighted that term, because I see it everywhere I go. So again, my name is Delcenia Glover. I'm campaign manager for the Alliance for Tenant Power, which is a coalition of organizations that include Tenants and Neighbors, Legal Aid Society, Community Service Society, New York Communities for Change, Make the Road New York, Casa New Settlement in the Bronx, Faith in New York. And we came together to organize a campaign to strengthen the rent laws when they come up for renewal in this June of 2015. We've been working together for a long time. We are also partnering with the Real Rent Reform Campaign and 1199 and other coalitions to make the campaign as big and as strong and as effective as we possibly can. One of the things, someone in the back asked a question, what to do. You can sign up. You can sign our attendance sheet, and you can be a part of the campaign to strengthen the rent laws. Even if you are not a rent-regulated tenant, if you care and if you enjoy the diversity of this city as far as income and culture, if you like New York, if you think it's a great city to live in, even if you can afford a market rate apartment and you're living in a market rate apartment, if you like New York, you should be concerned about this, because if we don't strengthen the rent laws, am I wrapping up?
Yeah, this is basically, we're just supposed to do introductions now and move into the panel.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'll just say, if we do not strengthen the rent laws this year, in June 15th, then rent regulation is on its way out. It's dying, and in 10 years, there will not be any rent-regulated apartments for you to move into, or your children. Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Glover.
So we can do like a minute each,
Okay.
whatever, and then we'll get into the panel, and everybody will have an
Okay.
opportune time to.
I got it.
You got it.
Okay.
I trust you, Gustavo.
This is why you hired me.
I believe.
I was going to, but I went. Second, we are joined by Miss Ilana Mayer. Ilana Mayer, who is the program director at the Met Council on Housing. They're also an incredible organization that has done much work in the last couple of decades to strengthen rent regulation and just to fight for tenants. So, Ms. Mayer.
Ilana, I work at Met Council on Housing. As Senator said, we are a citywide tenants' rights organization. We right now are coordinating the Real Rent Reform Campaign, which Delcenia mentioned. The Real Rent Reform Campaign, the Alliance for Tenant Power, we're both coordinating and figuring out what is the best way to mobilize tenants and really strengthen the rent laws. I know that we're only talking for a minute, but this is the year where all tenants, market rate, rent stabilized, rent laws really do affect everyone. My role at Met Council is I work with tenants, I do work with coalitions, and I do work with policy. My goal is to figure out how can we connect the tenants, make better policy, make better laws, so we can get to the root of the problem. Before this campaign, I came from the world of from electoral campaigns and Brian Kavanaugh's office, who some of you probably have worked with. So thank you for having me tonight.
Thank you, Ms. Mayer. we are joined by Jonathan Furlong, who's the Association for Neighborhood Housing and Development. He's a senior tenant organizer for that organization, and he's been working in the field of affordable housing development for the past 10 plus years. Mr. Furlong, thank you.
How's everybody doing?
Doing all right.
Good.
My name is John Furlong. I'm the senior tenant organizer at ANHD. We are a membership organization of 100 other housing development, housing organizing, housing advocacy groups across New York City. We provide training and technical assistance for our groups. We help them figure out campaign, issues that they're working on. We help them do policy work. And so our role in this fight is to help our members who are in this particular rent law campaign, figure out how to mobilize their own bases and how to move this thing forward. My role there is, to sort of facilitate that process. Before I was at ANHD, I was working at the Pratt Area Community Council in Brooklyn, New York for 5 years. We were very instrumental in the 2011 campaign. Before that, I was a lead organizer at a group called Housing Here and Now, and working on the 2009 campaign. So this is not my first rodeo. But I really agree with what's been said in terms of strengthening and not just a straight extender. If we don't stop sort of the hemorrhaging of rent-regulated units, we're not going to be having these things anymore. We can come here and drink and see each other and have a good time, but we'll be talking about how we're commuting in from other states like Jersey or PA or something like that. So this is a huge fight, so thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Furlong. And last but certainly not least, district leader, tenant advocate, and somebody who's born and raised in Manhattan, done a lot of work in tenant organizing, and is a dude that has taken on political fights a lot of people said were not necessarily the brightest ones to take, but he knew that at the time they were the right ones to make, and he's somebody that's and what I mean to say specifically is that when nobody was even saying that Sheldon Silver needed to be challenged as an assembly member, he actually put him to the test, and he actually ran against him. A lot of people advised him that he shouldn't, and he did. And that shows a level of character and political courage that not a lot of folks have. So certainly help us welcome Mr. Paul Newell.
Hi, I'm Paul. As I said, I'm a district leader in Lower Manhattan, Lower East Side, and I got involved in this fight because when I'm working with my communities, district leader is a job, despite Keith Wright's kind words, without a lot of formal power. And what it really is community organizing and working with the people in your community to try to express their strength. And the number one issue that people in Lower Manhattan and throughout this city are facing is the rent is too damn high. And but by far the strongest block that is protecting the integrity of our communities of these rent regulation laws. And what I do is I work with our tenants, help groups in small tenement buildings build tenant associations, also in larger NYCHA buildings. That's a different issue. And we're also working in Lower Manhattan, the financial district, to try and extend rent regulation to all these new rental buildings that have been built since 2001. We're trying to extend. All of those were built with government money. We're trying to make sure that all of those get rent protections extended to those so we can get thousands more units. And we'll hear more later.
Thank you, Paul. So, for those of you that are not familiar with the history of rent regulation, to say it very briefly, during the 20th century, from 1920 on, there were various times when the city and the state saw it necessary to involve themselves directly in figuring out what, as far as housing is concerned, as the population shifted, as commercial areas grew, as people moved from here to there, as the population grew, the city and the state saw an obligation to actually get involved directly in determining what was going to happen to rents in particular parts of the city and particular units. When they wanted to make sure that when families were moving out, when they were being priced out because of the marketplace, there's various times that the city and the state saw it necessary to actually regulate. So when we're talking about rent control and rent regulation, are both generally covered under the term rent stabilization. Both are different things. They're slightly different. Rent regulation is we have a rent control. We have a small number of units, about 38,000 in the city of New York. rent stabilization are the rest of them. Rent regulation, I'm sorry, the rest of them, and there's roughly 1 million of those. But in the last, just as Osina said, in the last 10 years, we've lost about 250,000 units. And just since 2011, when we extended the laws, we have lost about 50,000 units. So the calculations, and also something that Osina mentioned, is that if we continue at the same rate, we will actually lose all rent stabilization. All rent stabilized units about 10 years. Now, how do units become unregulated? Mostly by vacancy decontrol. And that is, if a particular unit gets to, what happens with rent stabilization, for those of you that are not in rent stabilized apartments, every year or 2 years you sign a lease extension that can either be 1 or 2 years. The percentage of increase from the 1 or 2 year lease is determined by a rent guidelines board that is controlled actually at the state level, which is an issue that we might get into. But the bottom line is that your rent goes up on a yearly basis or on a 2 yearly basis depending on when you sign the lease. And once the rent goes up to $2,500, the roof comes off. Then that unit can become a market rate unit. There's also the issue about a lot of landlords not letting the people that rent the apartments know that they live in rent-stabilized units, which happens all the time. So that, in a nutshell, is the battle that we're fighting. Also, when you're talking about rent regulation laws, there's a whole host of laws that refer to the rights of tenants as well as the obligations of landlords. But I'm going to put on my hat as the devil's advocate here and throw it to the panel. If I am a market guy, right, if I believe, and let's say I do for the sake of argument, that the marketplace, so the idea that if you do not involve, the government does not get involved, and the marketplace itself sets the prices, that they will kind of balance themselves out. And indeed, that this state control, what it's doing, it's actually lessening the quality of overall housing in the city of New York. And making the buildings, just not really giving the owners any reason to really make their buildings livable and high quality. You're actually perpetuating a system of bad housing. And the marketplace is the best way to get it done. If I said the marketplace is the best way to get it done, and we should get rid of rent stabilization because it's just making the market kind of go nuts. I mean, would you agree with that?
No.
Okay.
So this is a very common argument. One hears it a lot, and it's very central to the debate. You hear it a lot in places like the New York Post, but also in conversations. And here's a key thing. Folks that love the market, supply and demand, often tell you that rent regulation will increase his rent on market units because by pulling all those million apartments out of the market. It's nonsense. Rent regulation does not increase market rents. Can we get everyone to repeat that? Rent regulation does not increase market rent. Those million apartments are not empty. People live in those apartments. A lot of them are sitting right here. I lived in one for 15 years. If you allow landlords to evict all those people, which is what's going to happen to most of them if we lose protections, those people are going to be looking for homes. And you're going to take populations from places with a lot of rent-regulated units, like Gustavo's district, like the Lower East Side, and you're going to dump them on communities that don't have those. And you're going to see rents across the board skyrocket. You saw that in Cambridge, Massachusetts when they did it. You saw it in Santa Monica. In all sorts of places, rents increase across the board when you get rid of stabilization. As to the maintenance question, the number of people who bought buildings, landlords who bought buildings before rent stabilization came into effect in 1941. 1941, is that right?
Rent state or rent?
Well, either one. Rent regulation.
Federal rent control is 43,
43.
but the rent stabilization law, at least the basis of it, was 1969.
69.
So these are if you show me the landlord who bought their building without knowing that it was in rent stabilization and without knowing they were going to have obligations to maintain the housing that they provide to their customers, all of us who live in those buildings, we can have a conversation with them. But that's not what's happening in New York City. People bought that made that investment knowing that they're responsible for maintaining this building.
And just to kind of piggyback on that, I mean, I also don't buy the argument that rent regulation is bankrupting building owners. I mean, if you bought a building, you're basically getting about a 12% rate of return on your investment. So you're doing okay, and I don't think that argument is up very well.
Yeah, I mean, that when you look at the actual economic data, the rates have increased at a rate disproportionate to anything else in the economy. So when you look at how much landlords are making in comparison to anything else, the argument just doesn't really make any sense. How is it possible that 5 years ago, when an apartment that was market rate making a profit, is now the regulated apartments are more than that, and somehow the landlords are crying poverty now? It just doesn't make any sense to me. The data doesn't support it.
Well, I don't know if the landlords are crying poverty, but all I'll say is that the argument is so ridiculous that I'm not even going to join it. It's
Speak loudly
absolutely.
so you can hear it in the back.
Oh, I was just saying that I don't know about. I think there are some landlords, I guess, that are crying poverty, but the argument is so ridiculous that I'm not even going to join it. The rent increases, and I'm glad you brought up the Rent Guidelines Board. The rent increases that happen each year from the Rent Guidelines Board. The Rent Guidelines Board is a city board that with people who are appointed by the mayor. The rent laws are expedited by the state legislature, and then the increase for regulated units, but the increase is on how much your rent goes up every year or every 2 years, depending on when you sign your lease, is governed by the New York City Rent Guidelines Board. However, the increases that you get for every time you sign a lease from the Rent Guidelines Board, that's not the only money that the landlords are making. There's a thing called MCIs, and there is a gold rush happening on MCIs.
And MCI means?
MCIs are major capital improvements. So that means that if your landlord puts in a new elevator or a new roof or a new boiler or new windows, they are allowed to charge a percentage of that to the tenants, and it's not just until the amount is paid off. It's in perpetuity. It becomes a
Hold on,
permanent
Ms.
part
Glover.
of your rent.
Hold on, Ms. Glover. This is the devil speaking again. When you have, let's say I'm a property owner, right? I'm a property owner, and I have a building that I decide I'm going to renovate the roof and put in a new elevator. And let's say that conservatively that cost me about $4 million. Right? So I put $4 million into the building.
That's pretty steep, but okay.
I use very high quality materials. I want to make sure that this roof is going to last for a while. So
Did
I
you
put
use union labor?
I'm sorry. I'm gonna have to go. Hold on. I'm gonna have to go ask Papito whether he was union labor or not. But that's not the point. So let's say I put $4 million into this building, and now the building has a brand new roof that's gonna last for 20, 30 years. It has a brand new elevator. The other one was creaky and kind of crappy. So now that property of mine actually increases in value. So now you are living in a better building because I put that money in there. So you're telling me that $4 million, which is an investment, because this is a property that's an investment of mine. So I put in $4 million, and now I have a better building. You have a better building to live in. It's not going to get, leaks anymore because the roof has been protected, right? So it's brand new. So now I have a property that's actually more valuable, and I think that if there's like 70, 80, 90 people living in that apartment building, and I take the cost of that and I amortize it amongst these 90 or 100 people, and I do so over a longer period of time, it's yes, you can actually say, let's say it takes 2 to 3 years with a little bit of each rent to pay that $4 million off, but actually you have to pay a little bit more, I believe, because you are now living in a better building. Does that not make sense to you?
No.
Ms. Lowe? Tell me why.
Well, first of all, we're not arguing that the landlord should not be able to charge back a percentage of what they spent to the tenant. We're not arguing that.
Mhm.
What we are arguing is that it should not be a permanent increase in the rent.
But the changes
Because-
that I've made into the building are
Well, wait a
permanent.
minute. When a landlord puts in a new roof, it's because he has to put in a new roof to keep the building up to the standard that it already is. You know what I'm saying?
Mhm.
If a building needs if a landlord puts in a new boiler, it's because he has to put put in a new boiler to keep the building maintained in the standard that it's already
Call
rated.
replace.
I don't care what you. I don't live in the clouds, and I don't live to fly helicopters over the building that I'm living in. I don't give a damn on what the roof looks like. We just need a roof that protects the building.
Mhm.
If you want to put $1 million roof on there when a $200,000 roof could have sufficed, that's not on me to pay for it. I moved in, I had a good roof, and the roof should be maintained, and you put in a new roof to keep the thing maintained. I'm still living in my same apartment. We understand that you can charge back a percentage, but it should not be a permanent part of rent. I should not be paying for this roof for 50 years.
Any other
And
person
what
wants to
happens is
respond to the
that,
devil?
and what happens is that you end up, and it's compounded, right? So if I get a 6% increase on my rent as my portion of the MCI, when my rent goes up the next time, that's not a surcharge. That becomes a permanent part of my rent. And every increase that I get after that is going to include that. So
Let's make sure. Let's see
it goes
how the other
exponentially.
folks want to respond to the devil.
So, something that we see a lot. I will.
I know.
To add to what Dolphenia said, something that we see a lot is where landlords actually let something fall into disrepair. So, for example, we see a lot with boilers. The landlord, for an entire winter, the boiler will be going in and out. Tenants will be begging for winters on row, like, can you please fix it? Can you please fix it? We have people private people will come look at the boiler and be like, X, Y, and Z needs to get done. Landlord won't touch it until it completely breaks. At that point, the landlord can then apply for an MCI and say, well, I need a new boiler. It's going to cost me X amount of money, so you all need to help me pay for it. The problem is, even after it's paid off, the increase still stays. So the tenants were paying for heat but didn't have heat for an entire winter, maybe many winters. And now they're paying for the boiler even after the landlord's making a profit off it because they're paying for it even after it's been through. Another thing we see a lot is we see a lot of fraudulent MCI charges. So I just had a tenant who checked his rent history, which we can talk about that later, who basically saw in his rent history that for 3 years it said the unit was vacant because there was a large-scale MCI being done. He actually lived in that unit and can attest that nothing, including painting the apartment, nothing was done at all to the building. Papers were filed incorrectly. They're just blatantly lying in order to drastically increase his rent. So that's another problem. And those are two more problems, guys.
And MCIs are assessed per room, right? So they're taking the total cost of the improvement and they're assessing each apartment, and so you're paying an extra, however many dollars per room. So that's basically how they're.
And the only thing I would add is the real danger with the MCI thing is that because of vacancy decontrol, when an apartment gets over $2,500, they can take it out of stabilization altogether, and that's a lost unit for affordable housing. Each one of these improvements brings us closer, and a lot of the reason why they do these fraudulent MCIs is to get over that $2,500 line, so that we can have a destabilized, apartment.
Someone just came by my office today and dropped off an MCI application that their landlord had sent to them. And it's per room. And the increase will be $26 per room. So if you're in a four-room apartment, the increase is $104 per month. And this is a permanent addition to the person's rent. Forever.
You want that something?
Well, I just wanted to make a quick vacancy. We're calling it destabilization.
Deregulation.
Anyway, just so we're, when the apartment hits 2,500, it doesn't automatically go to market, right?
Right.
It's upon vacancy, so the
Right.
next person after
Right.
will inherit that cost. And another sort of caveat, another way that gets bumped up is through individual apartment improvements, and those are like cosmetic type of adjustments and fixes to the apartment. And what's
Okay.
I'm jumping ahead.
Okay. Let's say that I agree with everything that you're saying. Sure. Let's say that Ms. Glover doesn't already want to punch me in the face. Let's say that doesn't. Let's say that I accept all of that. Now, there's a lot of people living in rent-stabilized apartments
About
who are
2.5 million.
kind of wealthy people. I mean, we want to have rent-stabilized apartments so that people that are working-class individuals can live in the city. I get that. But then you have somebody who, because let's say that's a married couple, and they both make $100,000, $115,000, all of a sudden they make $240,000, $230,000 a year, and then they do investments as well. Let's say they get $300,000 a year. They're being given a benefit by having that rent stabilized apartment. Like, they don't deserve rent stabilization. We should just take it away. That's what I think.
Well, they don't get rent stabilization because.
But what if they live in a rent stabilized apartment and they are signing a lease that is in a rent stabilized apartment? What then?
Well, there's an income ceiling for rent regulated apartments.
Is there?
Yes, it's $200,000 a year.
So what if they make $200,000? If they make more than $200,000, they cannot live in a rent stabilized apartment.
Well, that's the law.
Okay. So how about $200,000? So what about?
If the rent is more than 25,
let me just give you some numbers here.
Please.
The median income for rent stabilized tenants rose slightly less than the rate of inflation between 2010 and 2014. And the median income in 2011 was $38,100. That was the median income for rent regulated tenant. And in 2014, it was $40,000. So I don't know who these rich people are that you're talking about.
Oh, I know.
That's just rhetoric, and it has nothing to do with the facts. Also, those people pay 33 on an average, 33.1% of their income in rent. So, do you have another question?
Can I illustrate this a little bit in the Lower East Side? Because other people say, the Lower East Side, or Community Board 3, which is roughly that,
Yes.
has a median household income of $31,000, $31,400, whatever. If you go on Craigslist, and the CB3 goes from 14th Street to Brooklyn Bridge on the east side. If you go on Craigslist and try to find a 2-bedroom apartment, you're lucky to find anything under $3,800, which is to say the market rent on an apartment is about 150% of the total median household income for the neighborhood. These are not millionaires living in dumpy 2 bedrooms in a stabilized walk-up. This is how the middle class and working class of New York City stays in our neighborhoods.
That's right.
Very low income.
And scene. Okay, so the devil's not here anymore. Just want to make sure. This is the reason I became that horrendous character is because a lot of these arguments I have heard made to myself. These arguments have been made to me both privately and publicly by folks who represent the interests of the folks that are property owners. And by the way, I'll put a parenthesis here, just because just like John said a little bit earlier, the property owners are not the enemy. There are some in my district that I have established good relationships with. These are folks that both are business owners, yes, they're businessmen and women, but they understand that part of their business is providing a space, as they tell me, as some of these folks, I remember the dude that owns my building, he tells me, I want to have an apartment that I can move my family into. And I've been very lucky. I've had like 3 different owners in the building, as I've been living there since 2000. But the current one, actually, that's the way he approaches it. So whenever I haven't had issues with him, he always comes, he fixes it. Whether it's, there's something wrong in the leaking or the door or what have you, he always goes there. But the point is, we want to make sure that as we're strengthening these laws, we do so with the idea that, yes, there might be some property owners that are good, and they are, and there might be some property owners that are having some, who are not necessarily making a mint. But it is not for those folks that we're talking about. I can almost, when I look at some of the property owners in my district that own 15, 20, 30 properties, and then I look, and it's one of the reasons actually in my part of the Bronx, by the way, $26,000 a year is the median income of my district. So it's even more, acute in a working class neighborhood like the ones that I represent. But it is the reason why in my part of the Bronx we formed all the local elected officials at the Assembly Council level that are in my Senate district. We formed the West Bronx Housing Coalition. The idea, among other things, is that when you have a tenant that goes to Latoya Joyner's assembly office to say that tenant is concerned about something that happens with their landlord. With communications in my office, and my Senate district goes all the way to 238th and Broadway, while Latoya might be at 170th and Grand Concourse. All of a sudden, the owner of the building over here also owns 5 buildings in my district over here, and we see the same type of problem, like the same type of pattern that's happening all across. Because as we said, part of the problem is that a lot of these bad landlords are working actively to move people out of their apartments, to flip apartments over. So I wanted for you to, and we're gonna conclude this in a second to actually talk about specifically what are the things that we want to change in the law, what are the campaigns that are happening right now, what are they focused on, and then specifically to say, because we're organizers up here, so we're going to ask you to do something at the end. But the last thing we can talk about before we go to that is, in your experience, as far as the difficulties that exist for tenants that don't have the information that some of us might have, and like what has been your experience, so that, and this is so that we can kind of, for those of us that are not live in rent-stabilized apartments or do not have the ability to know some of these folks. Some of them come into my office every single day. You folks work with them on a regular basis, and kind of contextualize it for us, like the difficulties that exist to people that don't have the information that we have.
Well, are you talking about the difficulties that tenants have?
Yes, ma'am.
Oh my goodness, it's so much.
Oh, well.
We work with tenants. My home-based organization is Tenants and Neighbors, and we work with tenants all over the city. We help them organize tenant associations, and we service tenants in many capacities who live in rent-regulated or Section 8 housing. And one of the biggest things that we get from tenants when they call up or stop into the office is that they don't understand their lease. They don't know what rent regulation is. They don't know what their rights are, and the landlords are just, and they're afraid of the landlords, and landlords are just getting over on these tenants. I got a lease. This woman who called, I met her at a forum like this, and I'm gonna be really quick.
Please.
And I gave her my cell phone number, and she was texting me over the weekend. I said, okay, with her issues, and I said, drop off your lease. And she said that she got an MCI application. I said, just make copies of it, and she dropped it off at the office. And I looked at it today, right before I left out of the office, because I wanted to make sure I looked at it on the same day that she gave it to me. And her lease, just a cursory glance at it. First of all, the rent stabilization rider did not come from DHCR.
DHCR is?
DHCR is
Division of Homes and Community Renewal.
Right. And this is the agency that regulates
At the state level.
at the state
DHCR
level.
is a state agency.
And regulates at the state level rent-regulated housing. So that was one of the first things I noticed, was that the rent stabilization rider that's attached to a rent-stabilized apartment lease, it was from the Rent Stabilization Association. And so that freaked me out. And then when I looked at her, and she had also gotten her rent history for her apartment, and it was definitely rent stabilized, but there were a couple of gaps in there where the rent jumped $200, and she said nothing had ever been renovated in the apartment. But the worst thing about it was that there are about 6 different riders attached to her lease. Illegal riders attached to her lease, and she had signed all of them. And so I have to go, I didn't read everything in detail, but I read enough to know that she should not have signed the riders on this rent stabilized lease. And those are the kinds of problems that tenants have. They get into situation, or they'll sign a rider and that they shouldn't have, and then they're in a situation where it's difficult to help them because you've already signed it. If when you sign your first, people who sign their first lease, if you sign the riders in the first lease, that's one thing. But people don't know that once you sign a rent stabilized lease, every lease after that, unless there's a change in the law, has to remain the same. They can't change the rules on you. That's one of the protections that you have as a rent stabilized tenant, and that And a rent-stabilized tenant has the right to a renewal lease unless you've had some really egregious behavior or just not paid your rent at all. You have the right to a renewal lease. Tenants who are regulated apartments don't even understand that either. So that's the way it's manifested, that the landlords are getting over on tenants, even like in your district, I don't know, I know this happens a lot in the Bronx. I don't see this a lot in Manhattan, but in the Bronx and Brooklyn, we see a lot of the illegal rent fees happening. Where the tenant where the landlord will bill a tenant an additional $5 a month or something like that if the tenant installs their own air conditioner, even when they pay their own electricity bill.
Even if they don't have an AC.
Yeah.
Sometimes even though that is.
Yeah.
So it's Mr. Furlong. It's $20.
Yeah, so-
I just want to ask a quick question to the audience here. Raise your hand. How many people have been to housing court?
Oh my God.
Was it fun? No.
Wow.
Okay. So I mean, I think I think that when no, I know it was I'm being facetious. So it's not fun. It's never fun. If Brooklyn, Bronx, wherever you are, it's a shit show. So I think that tenants who don't understand their rights and just so we're clear, 97% of court actions filed in housing court are filed on behalf of landlords. 97%. So there's this whole, it's this onslaught of landlords dragging tenants into court because they don't fully understand their rights as rent-regulated tenants. And just as a twist to that, and I know you had a point, and we'll let you, but I think that if we really don't strengthen the laws, that instances of harassment are going to continue. There's all kinds of crazy stuff that we have all heard about in our sort of individual counseling that we do, and I just feel like it's just going to get worse. I mean, if you've ever been to Bronx Housing Court, the line is.
I'll talk about it in a second.
Yeah,
I've been to housing court myself. Like I got taken.
But I just want to let
Yes. I was going to say, one of the things that Met Council does is we run a tenant help hotline. So almost 5,000 tenants a year call us with questions. Some of them are being really intensely harassed. And a lot of them just have quick fact checks. When I first started this job, I would have told you there are some really bad landlords, but I think most of them are probably decent. Right now, after working this hotline for a year and a half, I have no faith in any of the landlords. I don't believe that there's more than a handful of landlords out there in this city who are actually working for their buildings. I think almost all of these landlords are really doing nothing but trying to increase the value of their building. I would say a substantial number of our calls are people who they're not even calling to find out if the landlord is lying to them. A good example is we get a lot of people who call in and say, well, my landlord's being so nice about this. I have bed bugs or I have a leak or some other problem. And, my landlord says that they really wish that they could pay for it. But unfortunately, because I'm rent regulated, that they're prohibited from paying for that. Or else my apartment would be taken out of rent regulation.
Yeah.
Is there anyone who can help me pay? And they're calling me, and they're telling me, no, don't worry, my landlord is being so nice about it. And the landlords are just lying. They're just lying, blatantly lying. And there's no gray area here, right? Like there's no way the landlord doesn't know that they're lying. So I think that misinformation is one of the biggest weapons. I think fear is another. We get so many tenants who think that if they get organized, that they are going to be the next target. What they don't realize is that if you are a rent-regulated tenant, you are either being harassed or you already are the next target. There's no other category. And so I think really talking to your neighbors and really talking to people and really telling people that, this is the reality of the situation. It's a little bit bleak, but the upside is that there are so many amazing organizers out there who are working to change the laws, to strengthen the laws, and that we really do have a chance this year to repeal what I see as the root causes, and I think we'd all agree on that, which is vacancy deregulation. And if we can really repeal that, then we can change the system a little bit.
So I want to move into that because I want to make sure that we also have some time for some questions at the end.
Can I just say one quick thing? If you live in a building with more than 6 apartments, you should, if you don't have one, you should create a tenant association. It's very, very important.
Absolutely. So I want to make sure that we not only have a couple of questions at the end here, but that we have the opportunity to kind of talk amongst each other as afterwards. Since there's probably some beer left, and I haven't had even a single one, so I want to make sure that I do that. But so to move on to briefly to talk about some of the political realities this year. So as we talked about earlier, 2011 was when we extended rent laws, and we just did some very small changes to it. there was a big campaign then to change them, and many of the folks here were involved in it. I was involved in it myself. Unfortunately, we were only able to strengthen them a little bit. So now we find ourselves in 2015 when it's going to sunset in June 15th of this year. So on or before that, we as a legislature have to act. Now, what's happening is that there are many organizations that are forming coalitions, and I want to definitely have some folks speak about some of the work that they're doing. Now, the bottom line on this is that it is going to be important to bring pressure with as many folks as possible and aim the cannons at the right places. And what I mean by that, certainly since it's being recorded, not literally any cannons, but you have to make sure that you direct the energy towards the folks that we have to whose mind we actually have to change. In particular, I would suggest that the governor certainly needs to be pressured, as well as Republican senators in Long Island. The issue here, and this could take a long time, but I'll be very, very brief and say that the political realities right now is that we have a Democratic state, but we don't have a Democratic Senate. I'm in the minority conference, and we're only in the minority conference because of electoral defeats, but because of over a long time, because of gerrymandering, and because that's been the way that it's been for a while. We took over as Democrats for a very short period of time. It was a disaster. The dude that was there before me was one of the people that led the disaster. Where we are right now is that it's very possible that in 2016 we will take over as a Democratic majority, but between now and then, we have to deal with the reality that we have right now. And that means that we have to put pressure on the Republicans that have potential, that are in swing districts. And those are the folks in Long Island in particular. There's 9 Senate districts in Long Island. 3 or 4 of them are in districts which, even with gerrymandering, are close to being Democratic seats. And in a Democratic year, we can actually have an impact on that. We have to make sure that they feel, it is said that you either show somebody the light or turn up the heat. So we have to educate them as best we can, but probably at this point, between now and June, it is about getting that heat up and making sure that people know that we are mobilizing folks that are knowledgeable about the impact that not strengthening and extending the rent laws will have on working class people in the city of New York and the state of New York, and speak to the political impact that might have on people's re-election campaigns. So that as a brief thing, I would say that. Now in specific, I wanted folks that are involved in the campaigns at the state level to talk about some of the things that we are trying to change at the state, and then we're going to just briefly discuss some of them. We've actually mentioned some of them already, so then we can actually go to questions and have a conversation amongst us.
Okay, sure. We have the Alliance for Tenant Power and the Real Rent Reform Campaign. We have a joint legislative platform that includes 10 bills, 9 bills, and one that we hope will become a bill, to strengthen the rent laws. And I can't stress enough that if we don't close some of these loopholes, we will not have rent regulation. It's dying out. And this is the year that is do or die. We're calling 2015 the year of the tenant, and everyone who is a tenant needs to be active in the campaign. We've already talked about repealing vacancy deregulation, because that is the manner in which we lose rent-regulated units from the system. We've also talked about, actually we haven't talked about it. Is there anybody here who has a preferential rent or knows what that is? You have a preferential rent?
I used to, but I know what it is.
A preferential rent is in a rent-stabilized apartment, a tenant moves out, the landlord is able to do renovations in the apartment and charge a percentage of that to the next rent. And when a person moves out of a rent-regulated unit, there's also something called a vacancy bonus that can be up to 20% of the rent. So a person can move out of a $900 apartment, and by the time the landlord is able to add the increases to the apartment before the next tenant comes in, the rent may be, the legal regulated rent, I should say, may be $1,500. So it can go from $900 to $1,500. However, the apartment may be in a building, in a neighborhood, where they cannot command $1,500 for that apartment. So the landlord, so the landlord will give the next tenant a lease, and that'll say the legal regulated rent on this apartment is $1,500 a rent, but you are getting a preferential rent of $1,150. And so you move into the apartment. Okay, I can afford $1,150. But then, when the time rolls around for the lease to be renewed in 2 years, maybe, the market, there may have been the change in the market in that neighborhood through gentrification, and the apartment in that building can command the $1,500. So, when it's time for you to sign a new lease, your rent can go up to whatever is the legal regulated rent of $1,500. So, if you might have moved into the apartment and you could afford the $1,150, but you can't afford the $15. So what you're going to do is you're going to move. You move out. The landlord gets another 20% vacancy bonus on the $1,500, and he may go in there and put in some marble countertops or something and do some more individual apartment improvements, and the rent goes up even more. So you can turn over in two or three turnovers, and they work really hard to create an atmosphere to generate the turnover. In 2 turnovers, the apartment can go from a $900 rent regulated unit to a $2,501 market rate unit, just like that. And then it's out of the system forever.
So preferential treatment, and again, preferential rent, MCIs,
the vacancy bonus, which is big. The fraudulent, ending the fraudulent rent fees that we talked about before. And then there's rent control. Rent control relief is, okay, if a person moved into a rent-controlled apartment 35 years ago, and someone moved next door the same time to a rent-stabilized apartment, at this point, if the rent-stabilized apartment is like $1,100 or $1,200 a month, that rent-controlled apartment is probably $2,200 a month. Because rent-controlled tenants increase every single year, and it can increase, if there are no violations in the building, up to 7.5% every single year. So I have senior citizens on our rent-control leadership committee who are paying $2,200 a month for rent, which is 90% of their fixed income, because most people who live in rent-controlled apartments now are senior citizens on fixed incomes. So there's this myth out there that people who live in rent-controlled apartments pay less money for rent than people in rent-stabilized apartments, and nothing could be further from the truth. There may be some people in rent-controlled apartments who are paying these low rents, but the reason why they're paying low rents is because in a rent-controlled building, the landlord cannot increase the rent or if there are any open violations in the building. So there may be someone living in an apartment for 25 years who's never gotten an increase, and they're very few and far between. But that is because the landlord has not been keeping up the building, which is part of the rules for rent-controlled tenants. So what this bill would do is it would bring the increase for rent-controlled tenants in line with the increases from the Rent Guidelines Board for with an average of 3 years for people in rent stabilized.
Bottom line, because we're not going to have time to go over the whole thing, what you can do and you will do, because we just had the chance to discuss 3 or 4 different aspects. As we talked about, this is a very complicated issue, but the bottom line is that there are already campaigns that are working every single day to develop these pieces of legislation, to get them sponsored, to actually mobilize people to Albany, to mobilize people in the districts of the senators or the assembly members that are important to make sure that these things pass or don't pass. So it is going to be important for you to join that effort. I believe that
There are flyers in the back.
There's flyers in the back that you should take.
I mean, May 7th.
That's right.
May 7th.
So,
May 7th is a big rally day for New York City tenants, and we are gathering in Foley Square at 5:00 p.m. and then we're going to walk across the bridge. But this is massive demonstration. This is shut down traffic stuff because I mean you see how people. What is it? Black Lives Matter. They go out there, they shut down one of our young organizers, Jose Lopez, he likes to say, we shut shit down. We have to be as fervent about rent regulation as people are about these other issues. Because if rent regulation dies, we will lose all of our ethnic neighborhoods. We will lose our working class from this city. We will lose our middle class, because rent regulation is not just it's not poor people. It's the teachers. It's the nurses. It's working class and moderate income and middle class families.
Go ahead.
Go.
So I want to build on
May
that.
7th.
First, yeah, the May 7th event is an important one to be at, and there's going to be a lot more over the next couple months. People should follow. People who are on Twitter should follow at Real Rent Reform and a few other. Is it at Tenants and Neighbors or
Tenant Power New York now.
Tenant Power NY. But another thing.
And hashtag 1 million homes.
Hashtag 1 million homes. Another thing is that all of us should call all of our state reps. Now, I imagine most of the people in this room do not live in the district of Long Island Republic that we're targeting. That doesn't mean we can't reach out to them and pressure them. But it's also important to remember that this is going to happen in a negotiation in Albany. And while most of our legislators are probably nominally and even in their hearts on the right side of this, it's important that we let them know that this is a priority and that this is existential to our communities, and that we call them and say, listen, those Republicans in Long Island, they want some things, whether that's property tax issues, whatever. They want some things that we need to let our legislators know. Don't give them what they want until our tenants are protected and strengthened.
Yeah.
And this is coming, and as a legislator who is very supportive of these issues, I ditto that extra. Please do that. We always have to be kept. The best way to keep us honest is always to remind us who it is that we work for. This is a priority, certainly not only from. I live in an unstabilized apartment myself. I have tenants. Most of the folks in my in my district are working class people who need this resource. I understand how important it is. I still want to get those calls. So certainly, I think that this is important. We got to make sure that we pressure everybody. Yes, sir.
And just, as Delcini has said, May 7th is going to be a huge event. I encourage everybody to come and participate. We also need to, not only do we need to do things in the districts where these folks are, we need to go up to Albany and speak to folks up there in the Capitol. June 9th, there's going to be buses heading up to Albany. I know another date on April 28th. ANHD's membership is really spread pretty evenly through Alliance for Tenant Power and Real Rent Reform. If you're interested in going to Albany at some point, please come see me after. I can direct you to a group that's in your neighborhood that's going to be heading up there probably at some point. And then the second thing I'll say, and we can have a whole nother panel about this, but we also need to take control of our own rent laws. It's really a whole nother discussion, but years and years ago, the legislature voted to have the rent law decided up there. Now, there's not many rent regulated units or rent controlled units in Cuyahoga County. They're all here. And so I think another part of the conversation of what we're looking to change is to get control of our own rent laws so we can decide in the city what is best for us.
Yeah, I agree on that.
I
So
should say there's one more lobby day, Tuesday, May 19th.
See? Yeah.
Tuesday,
Exactly.
May 19th.
Right. Thank you.
So I know that Ms. Glover has to egress. The rest of us do not. But I want to make sure that and we're going to stay around so we can have some questions. Ms. Glover, you have to leave, but please, I want to make sure that we give all these folks a hand. They'll see Ms. Glover.
Applause Senator Gustavo Rivera, who knows more about standing up for power than many people will find.
So I want to have an opportunity because I know that you have to leave. Go ahead. But I know that there's a couple of questions. I know that the lady was very early on had a question. So the lady for 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and we'll try to do them quickly. So we'll quick question, quick answer. Yes, sir. Ma'am first.
Yeah, Esther.
Esther.
Okay, so MCI, how does that exactly work? I mean, I understand because I've been hit with a couple of MCIs, but when the landlord submits the MCI paperwork, the work that was done, the materials that were used, and the cost of that MCI, who is the watchdog? Who comes in and evaluates the actual cost to make sure that they're actually itemizing each item at the right market price?
Well, it's supposed to be the HCR, and
Again, Division of Housing Community
Right,
Renewal.
yeah.
So
Division of Housing and Community Renewal. But when you get a notice, when a tenant gets a notice of an MCI, and this is unfortunate, but it's incumbent upon the tenant
Right.
to do their due diligence and to figure out whether or not the landlord has done something for you. Usually, if this happens, I don't know what size building that you live
In a large building.
In a large building,
about
yeah.
10 to
I know what we do.
12
I live in a large complex, and what we do is when we get a notice of an MCI, we've been hit with a bunch of them over the years. Is that we go through it ourselves. Whoever is part of the tenant association who knows how to read legal documents and,
Yeah,
and bills
we've
and,
done
and count stuff up and all that stuff.
Right.
We'll have someone go with it. The first thing we would do is send a notice to DHCR that we need an extension, and if we see something that looks a little fishy, that doesn't look right, then we will you can respond to it. Once the tenants respond to it, then DHCR, it's incumbent upon them to send somebody out to do an inspection.
And number two, yes.
No friend of mine or even acquaintance can talk to me without giving me their list of contacts or contacting friends in the suburbs, particularly in these Long Island districts, but even by way of strengthening our assembly members. So I spent the day talking to friends who live in Michelle Schimmel's district in Great Neck, I live in Manhattan, and in Amy Paulin's district, assembly district in Scarsdale. A couple of them are members of book groups, they're in exercise classes, no one can speak to me. They do not have access to my personal bar or anything until they give me that list or they're willing to make those calls, and I think we're all going to have to do that. It's elementary in a way, but this year it's life and death.
Yeah.
So, and we've done plenty of favors for them in those other districts. So,
Yeah.
and beyond the state, the usual suspects of Gustavo's recalcitrant state senate members. The other thing is that in the 421A, the subsidies, well, today a lot of us marched for justice to get a minimum of $15, which is not enough to live on, but just as a starting point, we're trying to focus on people that are in the assembly who are, we're adding bodies to to oppose subsidies for rich people to live in empty filing cabinets in the sky. So the panel can address that later if they want, because I'm slurring there.
Got a lot of things. So that's actually one of the things that we're going to have to debate. Usually, what happens is that landlords come to us and say, we are not landlords, I shouldn't say that. The Senate Republicans in particular, are the folks that don't necessarily want to extend rent regulation because it doesn't really matter to them. They don't have that many tenants in their building, in their districts. They tell us, well, let's extend 421A as and 421A very briefly is for when you're building. When you're constructing certain buildings that have a percentage of affordable housing, then you get a certain tax break, etc. So the idea is that you can kind of, do a little bit of each. And so we're always told, they tell us, well, you give us that, we'll give you this. This year it's going to be very tricky to figure out exactly whether the balance or the pros and the con is actually falling more on the con side than the pro side. So that's going to be kind of an ongoing conversation. But I want to make sure that we get to the other questions. Yes, right there.
So I'm going to try and ask this as briefly as possible. I live in Williamsburg, which has been really hard hit. I live in a market rate building. I got 24 neighbors, most of whom are paying, $2,400 or $3,000 for a two-bedroom apartment. Across the way, we have rent-stabilized apartment buildings where folks are paying much less in rent. But if you were to examine the income of all of these people in the two buildings, after you deduct their rent, you would find out that the folks in my building might be more poor based on their disposable income than the folks who live in a rent-stabilized building, because the folks in my building are, striving actors and actresses and bartenders at night, or they're public school teachers, whatever. And I'm trying to listen to this conversation and figure out, what are you offering to my neighbors who are paying market rate? How are you going to benefit them with this housing activism, instead of only phrasing it as something that benefits our neighbors in the other building that's lucky enough to be rent stabilized?
So I would say two things. The first isn't directly answering your question, but everyone in your building should be checking their rent history. We see frequently, every single day, literally, I see people who should be paying $2,000, should be paying $1,800. When the tenant before them left, the landlord just jacked it up to $2,600, $3,000, because it's in an area like Williamsburg where the market rate rose so quickly that they could do that without anyone questioning it. So the first thing your building needs to do.
We've done that. And,
Okay,
and it's
okay,
not
so
happening.
that's if anyone's in a similar situation, that's the first thing you do. The other thing is that rent regulation benefits all tenants. The economics are actually very similar to union labor, whereas the more people who pay union wages, it forces other people to raise the wages as well, because no one's going to go work for a company. If you have the option between someone who's going to pay $15 an hour and someone who's going to pay, you're going to choose $15. So the economics work the same with rent regulation, because since they're already making profits on the rent regulated units, the more rent regulated units we have, the less competition there is for these apartments. So instead of having three people choosing between two crappy apartments, and the landlords can jack up the prices to no matter what, because they'll live in a studio for $5,000 because they have no other options. The more rent regulation we have, the more reasonable the rents become, and landlords are forced to bring down the rents a little bit, right? Like if we were to increase rent regulation, then landlords with market rate buildings wouldn't be able to charge $3,000 for a horrible tiny studio apartment that's rat infested, right? Because there would be options. And I mean, that's what we see though. That's what we see, is that every time you lose a rent regulated apartment, it means they can raise all the rents higher. So I really do think that when you take a look at the economics, rent regulation, it benefits us all. And we have to, in this room, start dispelling the notion that rent regulation only helps rent regulated tenants. It doesn't.
Four. Oh, you're four, yeah. From Stonewall Rebellion Veterans Association, and the movie will be out in 2 months, by the way.
Question, Williamson. Question.
Yeah. Pick up one of these. So the question is that many of our members knew I was coming here tonight with the wonderful Senator Gustavo Rivera and Keith Wright, who's also a supporter of the SBA, that are in Section 8 apartments. So that hasn't been covered. So that's what the question is for the panel. How does Section 8 apartments come into this rent regulation, or because they're not rent stabilized?
Yeah.
So we have a lot of members that are in Section 8 apartments.
So, does everybody know what Section 8 is?
Yes.
Okay.
Everyone doesn't.
Okay. I mean, I didn't want to jump ahead of folks. So it's a program that's basically administered by the federal government. Your rent is your contract rent is $1,000. If you have Section 8, you pay 30%, no more than 30%. Your rent is, the rent that you pay is $300. The government covers the rest, right? So they're making up the difference. So there's a few types of Section 8. There's two main types of Section 8. There's project-based Section 8, where the subsidy comes with the building. So the subsidy is attached to the apartment, and then you could have a Section 8 voucher. So you have the voucher, you go and look for a Section 8 apartment in another building. Rent regulation, and they really kind of don't. They really actually don't have much to do with each other. If somebody leaves is a Section 8 tenant and leaves they leave their apartment, it could be considered rent stabilized or rent regulated, but it really is a federal program that's administered by HUD.
Yeah.
And then the vouchers, the voucher-based tenants, those are either administered by HCR or HPD, but it's really a federal program.
Okay, so since we're actually kind of going a little bit over what we've been allowed to be in this room, and DC9 has been incredibly gracious. So what we'll do is we kind of have a little, we're going to end it so that we can have kind of the conversations that we're going to have, and then we can be on our way. But I will not do that before just reiterating something. It is, first of all, thank you all for being here. Not only thank you for DC9 for hosting us, thank you to my panelists for being here, but thank you all for being here. Obviously, you care about this issue. It's something that either impacts you, communities that you care about, people that you care about. We have, and many people have said it very clearly, we have an existential battle on our hands. We have something that, as I stated, just in my case being a personal experience, but an experience of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of New Yorkers, if rent stabilization did not exist, we would not be able to have working class people in the city. And in a time when we are living almost probably with the biggest wealth disparity that we've ever had in the city, it is incredibly important to have this as an asset. So the work that we're going to do in the next couple of months, me as a legislator, you as activists, with the organizations here, is incredibly essential to make sure that we keep this. I look forward to working along with you to make sure that that's the case. I know that I will be fighting as hard as I can in Albany to make sure that we not only extend it, but we strengthen them. But it's going to have to be all of us together to be able to get it done. Thank you for being here this evening. Thank you.